In this tutorial, you'll learn how to use the different selective editing tools to make adjustments to part of a photo, starting in this lesson with the radial gradient tool. First, if you downloaded the sample files from the Adobe webpage for this tutorial, add them to Lightroom CC as we've been doing throughout these tutorials. Click the Add Photos button here, navigate to the sample files, and in the Import Preview window, make an album for these files if you like, and click Add Photos. If you need more help with how to add files, you can always revisit the first tutorial in this Get Started series. Select this photo and then go over to the Edit button or press E on your keyboard. The selective editing tools are located in the column on the far right. The radial gradient tool lets you edit just part of a photo in a circular or oval pattern, kind of like a spotlight. So go ahead and click the radial gradient tool, and that changes the column of editing controls from global controls to controls that will affect only the areas where you add radial gradients. Now at this point you could just move into the image and drag out an oval or circular shaped gradient. But before I do that, I'm going to go to the exposure slider and drag it to the left, just so that you can better see the radial gradient that I'm about to add. And then I'll move into the image, and I'm just going to drag out an oval or circular shape. If you want a circular shape, hold down the Shift key as you drag. Although it may look like I just brightened the area inside of the border, the center of this shape is actually the same light tone that it always was. What's really happening is that my darkening adjustment is being applied most strongly outside the oval border, and it's gradually fading in at the edges of the border, which is why this tool is called a gradient tool. When I hover over the blue pin at the center of this shape, a red mask appears. The red mask shows where the adjustment is being applied. When I move my cursor away from the pin to another part of the photo, the red mask disappears. And if I move my cursor off the photo completely, the border and the pin disappear too. Now let's move this radial gradient where we want it and reshape it. I'll go back and hover over the pin, and then I'll click, hold, and drag the radial gradient on top of the model. I'd like this radial gradient to cover more of the model, so I'm going to change its shape by dragging any of the circles around the edge of the border. I'd like less of a darkening effect around the model, so I'll go over to the exposure slider, and I'm going to drag that more toward the center. But that's not all. I can apply multiple adjustments to the same gradient. For example, I'd like to saturate the color of the wood, so I'll go to the saturation slider, and if I drag the saturation slider to the left, that desaturates the colors outside of this radial gradient border. If I drag to the right, it saturates those colors. Let's try adding another adjustment to this radial gradient too. I'll go to the clarity slider and I'll drag that to the right, and that sharpens and adds contrast to the midtones, which brings out some of the wood grain in the fence. I can also change the softness of the edge of this radial gradient. To do that, I'll go up to the feather slider, and if I drag that all the way over to the left, you can see the edge of my radial gradient getting harder, and if I drag to the right, that edge gets softer. When I'm happy with my radial gradient, there's nothing that I have to do to save it. I could just go forward sharing this photo or making other adjustments. You can even have more than one radial gradient. Let's go in and make another radial gradient. This time I'll hold the Shift key and drag to make a circular gradient. And I'm going to invert this gradient so that the adjustments I add to it will affect only the inside of the gradient. To do that, I'll come over to the column on the right and I'll click Invert. Now I'm going to increase exposure to lighten the area inside of this gradient. And I might add another effect too. Maybe I'll drag the temperature slider to the right to warm up this spotlight with some yellow. So now that I've got multiple radial gradients on this image, each one is represented by a different blue pin. If I want to make changes to one of these, I'll just select its pin. Let's select that spotlight radial gradient again, and you could delete a radial gradient altogether by right-clicking or control-clicking on a Mac on its pin and choosing Delete. So that's how to edit part of a photo with radial gradients. There are lots of practical and creative uses for this tool, so have fun experimenting with it on your own photos.